You may quite seriously be thinking about starting your own business. Perhaps you've been made redundant or have seen others made redundant, and you're starting to think that you'd rather have more control over your destiny. But the thing is, you've got commitments, you've got a family to support, you've got to keep a roof over your head, you've got to put food on the table. How do you know that any business idea that you have you can turn into something which is going to succeed, which is going to help you maintain the lifestyle that you want? Well, that's what we talk about in this episode. I'm Jeremy Klein, and this is Change Work Life. Hello and welcome to Change Work Life, the podcast that's all about beating the Sunday evening blues and enjoying Mondays again. I am delighted to have as my guest this week, James Mulvany, serial entrepreneur. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy.
James, why didn't you start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about you and what you do?
Absolutely. So my name is James Mulvany, as you mentioned, founder and CEO of a couple of companies. My two current ventures are radio.co and podcast.co. Both companies are offering services and software solutions in the radio and podcasting spaces. Basically, my journey has been, I've always had different internet businesses since I sort of turned 16 years old. I left school to use that time over the summer holidays to sort of start hustling and making money online. And as a result, I've never actually had a job working for anyone. You know, over the years, I've had very many different ventures. I've had successes, I've had failures, and these are kind of my current two projects. Radio.co is about 5 years old. Podcast.co is about a year old. So with radio, it's pretty profitable now. It's very successful. We've got about 4,500 customers. Podcast.co is still in the growth phase. So we're kind of still overcoming a lot of challenges, but you know, it's a very exciting place to be.
And podcast.co, that's what sort of hosting and that sort of thing services for podcasters?
Absolutely, exactly. It's a platform for podcasters, so you can upload your podcast and we push it out to all the main channels such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And then more recently, we've also launched a spin-off platform called Matchmaker.fm, which is how we met, which is really a sort of, we're billing it like the Tinder for podcasters. So it's how you connect guests and podcasters together. Matchmaker is growing at a phenomenal rate. We're really excited about that project and we're making lots of valuable connections. So kind of interested to see where that's going to go as well.
And having signed myself, I can say it's definitely not as sleazy as Tinder either. Not that I have signed up for Tinder, but as I bet. Anyway, moving on. I just wanted to pick up on, you said that you basically left school and started your own internet business.
Yes.
That's pretty unusual for most 16-year-olds. I mean, most 16-year-olds will either, go on to sixth form college and continue till they're 18 and maybe go on to university, or they will go into work. They won't go straight into starting their own business. So how did that happen?
It was interesting. I mean, I did actually end up going to both sixth form and then obviously university. But you have this period of time, when you get to the end of high school, year 11, called study leave, which is obviously, I think you have about 2 months where you're supposed to study for exams. And then obviously occasionally you have to go in to do an exam. I thought to myself, well, this is a great time. I've got this time off and I don't have to be in school. So I didn't really do very much studying. But what I did do was kind of like my own type of study. And I can't really explain exactly how or why this happened. I think probably the lead up to this period, I'd sort of taught myself how to use Photoshop and I started to design websites and I was kind of interested in that. This was in about 2003. So, the internet was still kind of in its infancy then. It'd been around for 10 or so years, but it was nothing like it was now. There wasn't these huge social media channels. And the idea of launching an internet business was still very foreign to a lot of people. So my friends were going out getting part-time jobs. You go out, you get a job in McDonald's or you do a paper round or whatever. And sort of throughout that period between sort of 16 and 18, I just tried various different things. I wanted to make money online. I just thought, well, why should I have to go and work in McDonald's? I don't really want to do that. I'd rather sit behind my computer and kind of nerd out a little bit. So I taught myself to say how to build websites. I used to design those little annoying animated banners for people to remember that used to be on websites flashing away in the corner, little animated GIF banners. So I had a company that basically provided design services, created those banners, used to get a handful of orders every week. So really, by the time I got to the end of sixth form, I was making enough money that I was earning a kind of part-time living, if you like, just from being resourceful and using the skills that I'd kind of picked up on my own. They didn't teach this stuff in school back then. Even in IT, it was all about Word documents and spreadsheets and access databases. And I remember thinking, well, this is great, but this is not stuff that's really going to be useful in real life moving forward. I think I probably just picked it up just by sort of teaching myself. And again, back then you didn't have things like YouTube. You can learn any skills you want now on YouTube. You don't have to go and spend a load of money on a big course or buy books. There's really infinite amount of wisdom out there now. And back then, there were certain tutorial sites and things, but it wasn't as good as there wasn't the options that you have available now as someone who's looking to learn. So I think part of it's just the age thing as well. I think, when you're that age, you have this kind of curiosity. You want to learn things. And you're very much just like a sponge. I think it's very easy to pick up new skills when you're that age. I think it's the older you get, the more you have to focus on trying to learn new skills, basically.
And how did you know at age 16 that this was something that you could do instead of going to McDonald's? Because, thinking back to when I was 16, I worked in Sainsbury's and, everyone had the Saturday job at wherever it might have been. So
yeah, absolutely.
Where did this come from? How did you sort of know that this was something that you could do and that you could make a bit of money from it?
I think it was probably partly due to my dad. My dad always said to me that when we were growing up, he had his furniture business. He was an antiques dealer. He always said to us, it was always the best decision he made was going self-employed. Before we were born, he did various different jobs in different industries and kind of hopped from sector to sector. And he just never felt like he had that sense of freedom. So I think that was probably one of the main influences. Dad always just said, it was the best decision he made. So I think I thought, well, rather than going and working for someone else, maybe I could just try and make some money working on my own and doing what I want to do. And of course, at that age, it's trial and error. You don't have any outgoings. You're living at home with your parents. And then obviously when I went off to university, I still had my student loan to fall back on. So I would kind of use that sort of 4-year period to really test and develop my ideas and kind of come out of university with a business that could stand on its own 2 feet. And I didn't have to then go out and find a job.
And when you came out of university, was it the same sort of thing? Was it still the sort of web design agency that you were working on?
No, so that's at that point I pivoted. I considered for a period going into radio as a DJ, and that was kind of one of my interests, probably towards the end of sixth form. Started doing a bit of work experience, working on local radio stations and that kind of stuff. And although I liked the industry, I had this fascination with the technology side of stuff. At that stage, I was sort of learning to code properly. So I was teaching myself a programming language called PHP. I think then I sort of merged the two and two together because I learned the process of how you actually broadcast online. So I ended up setting up a business called Wave Streaming, which I think I launched in about 2004, 2005. And then I grew while I was at university into a state where, it was a proper business by the time I finished. And about a year after I graduated uni was when I took on my first member of staff. And then obviously things started to grow even further from then.
Were people at university aware that you were doing this? And
yeah.
So what did they think?
I think, it was interesting because I think actually a lot of the academic didn't really get what I was doing. They still found it a lot confusing. This was 15 years ago now. They still found that the idea of the fact that I was running a business, but it was just like existing online, very, very peculiar. I think it was still kind of like totally a new concept to people then. And obviously it wasn't an e-commerce store. So they kind of understood e-commerce stores, or you could buy like shoes online, or you could, buy items and have them delivered. But it was software as a service. And I think they were a bit sort of dumbfounded by it. Interesting, when I was doing my placement year, I said to them, like, I'm not, going off to work for another company because I've got this business. I need to use this year to refine and grow my business. And the placement unit weren't very happy with that because they didn't sort of feel like they had a sort of structure for me. But I kind of said, I'm not going to consider working for anyone else because I've got a good thing going here. So I then used that year to grow the business even further and really properly validate the idea, I think. But they kind of had to sort of, fit me into some weird structure where everyone else was following a certain kind of formula, if you like, for the placement year. And they obviously have, the employer would report back on how the person was doing. But because I was my own employer, I couldn't do that. So it was a bit of a funny one, but they did support me in the end. I had to argue with them for a bit to kind of say, look, I'm really 100% sure this is the right thing for me to do. But I think academics, they've got the very sort of structured in the way that they approach things. So as soon as you throw a spanner in the works, they're kind of like, oh, what do we do here?
Leaving aside the nature of the business, just the fact of running a business or starting a business when you're at university. University has a certain reputation for what students get up to there. You've got like that 8 hours a week of lectures and 4 hours a week of tutorials and lots of free time when you're supposed to be studying, and a lot of time spent in various stages of inebriation. What were your mates at university, what did they think of this? I mean, were you still sort of like going out and socializing, or were you going, sorry guys, no, I can't come to the club tonight. I've got some programming to do.
I used to get back at 4 a.m. from nights out and sit and answer emails from customers, So yeah, I mean, I did all that as well. I just, it was, I suppose it was just a case of, you have to find the balance between lectures and actually doing the coursework. My course was very coursework focused. I didn't have any exams actually. So it was very, you'd find time to do coursework, but also I suppose I wasn't using every single hour of every single day to launch the business. It was very much just like, I guess you could kind of call it a lifestyle business at the time. So I just fitted it around my lifestyle, and I was not delivering a service that required me to do anything. I was selling software online. So that's the key, is like you're selling something of value to someone. They're not actually paying you for your time. They're paying you to use the service, use the software. So your time really is spent acquiring new customers and also supporting existing customers, dealing with any kind of inquiries that come in about the service. So as a result, that's why I transitioned from like doing web design jobs and that sort of thing, because that's when you are providing a service that you have to invest your time doing into actually something that you can create once and sell again and again and again.
The topic that I really wanted to discuss with you, which I think you're exceptionally well placed to talk about, is the process for assessing whether or not a business idea is likely to have any legs and whether it's likely to succeed. And if I just set the scene with the sort of person who will be listening to this podcast, someone who they're in a job, and maybe it's quite a well-paid job and they're doing quite well and they've got the trappings that come with that. So they've got another half, they've got kids, they've got a mortgage, perhaps commuting, they've probably got one or two other things on which they spend their money. They're used to going on a couple of nice holidays a year, all that sort of stuff. But they have a feeling that now is the time that they would like to basically work for themselves. And to put this in a bit of context, we're recording this interview beginning of June, when the country is hopefully beginning to come out of lockdown in coronavirus. And it's a time when a lot of people are going to be reassessing their careers, their lifestyles. And also it's going to come into quite sharp relief how little control people have over their own destiny and their income. You could be employee of the month or employee of the year, but if your business is one that's been completely decimated by coronavirus and you're made redundant, then there's nothing you can do about it. But I think the biggest fear that people will have, or at least one of the biggest fears people will have going out on their own, starting their own business, particularly if they have this lifestyle to which they've come accustomed, how do I know it's going to be successful? How do I know I'm going to get paying customers? How do I know that I'm going to be able to support myself and my family and pay the mortgage and put food on the table and all that sort of thing? That's the sort of thing I wanted to cover. But before we get into that, can we just take it one step further back and talk about how you get your ideas for businesses? Because there's definitely going to be people out there who want to go in business, but they don't necessarily know what they want to do. Well, they might have a few vague ideas, but how have you come up with the ideas that you've implemented?
This is a good question. And I think it's not very easy to answer because I think it's different for everybody. I think, firstly, the main thing for me is you've got to be passionate about whatever it is you're getting into. There's got to be some kind of personal interest or personal attachment for wanting to do it, because ultimately a lot of people who get to, say, their late 20s or early 30s, they've done a few years in the corporate world. Maybe they've climbed the ladder to a certain point, like you say, they've got a kid or they've got a kid on the way. And then they start thinking, this isn't for me. I'm sort of sick of just the kind of the rat race, as everyone calls it. But what do I do? Obviously, it's kind of not always going to be, you can't always just take your current employment, your employer, the business you work for, and duplicate that. And perhaps you've got, exactly, you don't often want to. So I think the first thing is it's just looking at your passions. What actually are you interested in? Or what have you been maybe got interested in but not had time to actually do? And then trying to think about, is there a commercial angle on that? So for example, I, wanted to go into radio as a DJ. I didn't think that the scope of the market meant that, number one, it's quite hard to break the industry anyway. Number two, making it big time in that industry, your chances are so slim. So to actually make a lot of money, doing that, the odds are really stacked against you. So I kind of thought, right, okay, well, I'm interested in radio. I like broadcasting and being a DJ, but also I would like sort of development and technical stuff and building websites. So what can I do? Well, why don't I sell services to that industry rather than actually being involved in the industry directly? I thought it would be a better way of kind of growing revenue to sort of be sort of sat on the outside. I'd learned enough about how the industry worked, how people tick, I guess, within that sort of market, that I could kind of write effective sales copy and sort of make sure that, I was knowing what I was selling and I could kind of speak their language, if you like. So I think starting with your passions is an interesting way to sort of begin, and actually thinking about, what it is you genuinely have an interest in, because ultimately you start a business and you've got to really give it your all to begin with. You've got to, like I said, I was used to be getting home at 4:00 in the morning sometimes and answering emails. There'd be other nights I'd be up till 11:00 at night working away. I remember like Christmas Eve at around midnight. It's the first year of my university degree. I was back at home, obviously, and I was just on my computer coding away till midnight on Christmas Eve. So it's kind of the first year or two are always going to be intense, I think, when you're starting any kind of new venture. It's quite hard to sort of guarantee success, I think. Again, that's part of the risk of being an entrepreneur, is you have to take risk and you have to understand that sometimes things that you try may not work out. And in that situation, when things aren't working out, you've either got to be really reactive and trying to make it work, trying to figure out what you can change, how you can pivot to sort of, steer it back in the right direction, or you have to just quickly move on, give up, but make sure you learn from those mistakes and make sure you're really picking up on things and your errors of why it's not worked.
Having been through that process, come up with something which particularly interests you, which you can see yourself enjoying, even if you have to work really hard on it. Just because you like something doesn't mean that other people are going to pay you to do it. Are there steps you can take? Are there things you can do at the outset, perhaps even before you quit your job or make any substantial changes, to start to look into whether or not the idea you've got is something that there is a demand for?
I think a great example of how to do this well would be what we did for Matchmaker. As I mentioned earlier, I'll just give you a kind of quick brief primer. So Matchmaker.fm, it's a platform. We spent time building that platform. Our development team actually had to write code to make it all work. We had to design it. And it is a product in itself. It's a standalone platform. Now, to actually create that obviously costs a lot of time, a lot of money. As a business, we have to invest in making that happen. However, before that, we, as I say, launched podcast.co, and we were looking at different funnels of ways that we could engage with podcasters to get more people onto the podcast.co platform to generate opportunities for us. And we were looking at the podcasting space in general, and we thought, okay, well, look, most podcasts are based on interviews. There's about 60%, I think, of podcasts are actually based on either having guests on or, interviewing people. Wouldn't it be great if we can put a couple of marketing funnels on our site together to sort of attract these kinds of people, either people who are looking to be guests on podcasts, so not necessarily people who have their own podcast, but they might consider themselves an expert in X field, or they might be an entrepreneur who's looking to promote a product they've just launched, or an author looking to promote a book they've just launched. And a great way to do all of this is appear on other people's podcasts. So that was one funnel. We had a page which basically said, do you want to be on more podcasts? Do you want to be on high profile podcasts and get lots of listeners to raise awareness of your personal brand or your business or whatever? Please complete this form. Tell us more about what sort of podcast you want to get booked on, and tell us more about you and what you do, why you think you'd be a good guest. And that was just a Google form. We spent probably an hour creating that page, and that was just on the podcast.co site. Likewise, we had another page which was aimed more at podcasters, saying, are you looking for more interesting guests? Are you sick of having to go out and find guests? Do you want an easy way of just reaching really interesting people? Please complete this form and tell us about your podcast, the sort of guests that you're looking for, a bit more about, the general vibe of your show, I guess. So we had these two different funnels, these two different pages. And originally the idea was, well, we can then just use these as kind of like lead forms, lead magnets. We can kind of say, hey, anyone who signs up, you're interested in starting a podcast, sign up to podcast.co perhaps. So what we noticed was these forms were getting a really, really good response rate, and people were going to great lengths to actually fill out these forms and tell us about themselves or tell us about their podcast and why it was so great and why they're looking for guests. So we kind of sort of put two and two together and thought, well, we actually need a way of now connecting these two people together. So this is a really good way of testing a market. Basically, you can spend some money on AdWords if you wanted, drive some traffic to a simple page like this with very little on. But if people are actually engaging with that page and giving you information about themselves or their podcast, we kind of knew, well, there's obviously demand for this type of service. We hadn't spent any money really doing anything at this point. It was a simple exercise. It wasn't, we spent 6 months building a platform, launched it and found that no one was interested. But that was the kind of catalyst that allowed us to then say, right, let's actually do this properly. Let's actually create this service to connect podcasters and guests. That's kind of a good, solid, sort of tested method of validating demand from market, is just literally put up a page that promises a service, even if it doesn't actually exist. And I think, again, people feel a bit sort of sneaky about doing this because you're like, oh, is this not just misleading people? It's like, well, yeah, I guess so. But then what you've got is a good, solid data set that that people are interested in. And also not only that, but a marketing list of people who will then want your service or product once it's ready to actually go live. So you can say, follow up with them in 6 months once you've built the thing and say, look, here it is, just go and sign up. And of course, then you've got people who are ready and waiting to join.
So this is in the context of your pre-existing business, podcast.co, people who'd already signed up to that, people that you could get in touch with. And I'm just thinking of someone who is just starting out, who doesn't yet have that list, how they go through a similar process. And I wonder if a way of answering that question is to ask you how you knew that there was a demand for podcast.co in the first place. I mean, why set up another platform when there are, lots of other great podcast providers out there? What told you that there was a market for another provider?
The fact that you just said that there are other providers out there, sometimes competition is a good thing. It shows that there is demand. It shows that there's a market in place. I think a lot of people, especially in the tech world, they always assume that products have to be hugely disruptive. If you can go in and do something slightly different, slightly better than other people are doing it, and take a slice of the pie rather than thinking, I'm going to have to go in and completely revolutionize an industry. There's nothing wrong there. You can build a good, solid business by just going in and just taking a slice of the market. If there's competition, there's a demand for the market there. That was really our kind of reason for doing podcast.co. And obviously also because we're involved in the radio industry as well, we had more and more clients coming up to us and saying that they wanted podcasts as well as running their radio stations. They were launching podcasts as a sort of separate thing. So the question for us really was, do we build this as a feature into the existing platform? When we looked at the market, we thought, well, there's a lot of opportunity here. There's lots of people starting podcasts right now. Again, if you go on something called Google Trends, it's a really good way of just like gauging people's interest over time. If you go onto Google Trends and type in the word podcast or podcasting, you can see obviously there was a lot of interest probably 10 or so years ago, and then it sort of dipped, and then occasionally you get these peaks. And if you can kind of spot a trend of something that's growing at the moment, there's suddenly been loads of investment in a certain area. Well, sometimes that can be a very good indicator that it's a good industry to go into.
When you started podcast.co, presumably you didn't want to create a carbon copy of the other providers that were out there. So how did you identify what you needed to do differently or do better that other providers weren't doing?
Well, one of the things that we noticed with a lot of the providers were a lot of them were very old school. Like they were companies that had been around for 10 years. They hadn't really bothered updating the look and feel of the sites and the products themselves. So the UI, the UX, the user interface and user experience wasn't great. They were kind of clunky and felt a bit old school. So that was the first thing. We wanted to create something that's kind of clean, fresh, modern, and simple to use. And as I say, we've got kind of experience in that anyway. We know how to design effective and easy to use products. So that was kind of like the first target. The second thing was multi-tenanted platforms. Most of these companies didn't allow for like multiple users. They were just like, you sign up, just me. And we thought, well, a lot of podcasts sometimes have a producer attached to them. So we wanted to make it, more friendly to people who have different team members working on different podcasts. So we kind of added a layer of user level control to it, which again, many of the competitors don't have. Some of them have started to implement it now, but certainly when we started designing podcast.co, it was quite a rare thing. Again, having multiple podcasts under one account was quite important because we see that there's a lot of podcast networks springing up, which is kind of a collection of podcasts. What else do we look at? Also, just the submission process. So the way to submit a podcast, I'm sure you're probably aware of this yourself. You've been through it. It's not the most user-friendly experience. You have this thing called an RSS feed. For someone who's coming into podcasting completely from, a totally different industry, they don't really understand how it works. It's quite a daunting prospect. What is an RSS feed? It's this horrible looking page of code which basically describes when new episodes are released, etc. So our perspective was really, well, users shouldn't have to even see or understand what that is. So we wanted to build in a kind of done for you submission process. Again, a lot of the providers are now offering this, but certainly back then it was 2 years ago, this was still like, here's your RSS feed, you go and submit this yourself. We wanted to just have like a done for you process. So all users had to do is just say, yes, please do this for me. And we just go out and handle that side of things for them. So those were a few of the kind of initial kind of key points we wanted to make to sort of make ourselves stand out in the market, and things that we want to do differently from the other providers.
Did you look at this from this perspective of, these are things which we'd like to see, so we're going to try them and see whether they bite? Or had you done market research with existing podcasters to find out what the pain points were? And so you had a better understanding that these were things that they wanted? Because you mentioned, out-of-date user experience and that sort of thing. Were you seeing people telling you they found this a pain, and so you knew from other people, not just what you saw, that there were opportunities here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we did a certain amount of market research with our existing customer base of radio.co, because again, a lot of those customers would want podcasts. You also do research by just looking around at what are people discussing online, go on things like Reddit, have a look on forums, and just kind of get you can run polls, you can do this, you can do that, just go to places where there's lots of people hanging out and discussing a specific topic, find groups on Facebook, and just like get involved with the community, get involved with the audience, and see what people are commenting on. I think that's another good way of just sort of doing market research. It can be quite easy, you don't have to go and hire a market research company to do it. I think you can, again, when you bring a product to market, treat it like an MVP, treat it like something that can be reiterated and can be improved upon. You don't have to have every single feature in the world to begin with. You can kind of launch a product that get a user base, and then sort of start listening to that user base and adding features and functionality based on what they're saying and what they're asking for, versus thinking, again, I think people get too caught up when they're building software products. It's got to do everything in the world and suit everybody. But actually, the reality is you can't please everyone. You're only ever going to be able to please a certain group of people. And the more features, the more buttons and things you add to a product, the more confusing it gets. So sometimes simplicity is key, I think. And certainly to begin with, you launch a simple product that just does a few things, does them really well. That will then give you a few users. And then you can say to those users, okay, what else would you like to see? And start building functions and features to suit what they are asking for.
So going back to my person who's just starting out and wants to have an idea as to whether or not a product's going to succeed, then what you've been saying about, we'll start with the forums, the Reddit groups and Facebook and that sort of thing. That's a good way that they can see what people are talking about and get an idea as to whether there's something in it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you think about Reddit or Facebook groups, there's literally a Reddit thread for anything you could possibly imagine now, isn't there? It's again, you could go down a bit of an internet hole, I think, on those types of things. But there's lots of people discussing stuff, so it's certainly a good way of starting to pick out what potential opportunities there could be. One of the things that's come around recently on LinkedIn, you can run polls on LinkedIn now, and we've just run a couple, and they've had really, really good response rates. I don't think it's a feature that's existed for a long time. I don't know exactly when it was released, but I'm thinking it was maybe just released in the last couple of weeks. The benefit of LinkedIn, obviously, is it's more of a business-focused community. So with Reddit, for example, there's all sorts of stuff going on there. Some pretty crazy folks out there discussing some pretty weird stuff, which isn't always going to be like the best thing to base a business decision on, right? But if you say, look on LinkedIn groups, or you run a poll on LinkedIn saying, which of these are most important? So for example, the poll I just ran on LinkedIn, a couple of them was, what's the most important thing to consider when starting a podcast? Gave 4 different options: good concepts, good equipment, great name, marketing strategy. And another one we run, why did you first start podcasting? It was business, marketing, branding, to engage with customers, to make new connections, or as a hobby. And it's kind of interesting to see then, what people comment and start sort of discussing below these polls. But it's a good way of opening up a conversation with a potential market.
So if you use polls like that to start to see what people are saying in terms of what the pain points are and what the difficulties are, do you start to have conversations about possible solutions? So do you go to them and say, okay, so I see that you've talked about that. Well, would something like this help you?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's the key thing, isn't it? Is actually engaging with people, having conversations. People always say just go for, I've had people actually come up to me, because obviously we're now kind of got our foot firmly in the door in a podcasting space. I think I've had 2 or 3 different meetings where people have just come to me and said, I'm thinking about launching a product in the podcasting space. Can I get your opinion on it? Generally speaking, people will say, yeah, if it's not going to be done, like you're not going to direct competition with someone, but it's a similar tool in a similar space, could complement your customer base. It's good to start having those conversations and building your network, I think.
Do you do beta testing. So when you've kind of identified a thing and you've maybe spent the minimum you can to get your minimum viable product, do you then sort of get some people to have a look at it when it's in a rough and ready state? And if so, how do you go about getting those people?
I mean, again, with podcast.co, we had a private beta, which we initially launched to probably just, it was just, we put a site form on the site. So actually before launching podcast.co, we spent a year creating the brand. So we actually had lots of content, videos, all that sort of stuff before we even had anything to sell, which meant that by the time we actually launched a product, we already had a solid group of people which we could say, do you want to test this out? And then obviously once they finish testing, do you want to become a customer? So it's quite straightforward for us to start getting testers. But if you haven't spent time doing that, go hit up some groups, go hit up some communities, just say, look, we've got this software, we're looking for testers. People love playing around with new things, I think, as a whole.
And going back to my person who's getting quite interested about this, what's the one piece of advice that you'd give someone who is starting out? Maybe it's the first thing they should do, or just the thing that every person who's starting out should know.
That's a good question. You throw me a bit there. So how to answer that is just one piece of advice for someone who's looking at saying jumping ship and going into starting something on their own. I'd say just make sure you validate the market first. That's the main bit of advice I give, which I discussed. I think we've talked about a few different ways you could do that, really, but I think that's probably the most important thing, because you don't want to. I have seen it where people have spent loads of time working on something. You watch Dragon's Den, and sometimes you see these inventions, and you're just like, "It's what's this for?" Like, it's solving a problem. It's a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, and you want to make sure that you're definitely not creating something that's a solution for a problem that doesn't exist.
What's the sort of biggest word of warning you'd give? And I think that kind of, you've already done that in saying that you should go out and validate. What's kind of the most difficult thing? The thing that, as an entrepreneur, if you had a magic wand and someone could say, I can take away one problem, what would you like me to take away? What would it be for you?
Oh, that's a good question. Part of what you do is overcoming challenges, and that could be anything from staff to not having enough customers, not generating enough revenue, through to, difficult customers or people not being happy. There's no magic wands to erase any of those things. You have to be a really good problem solver. You have to be able to be faced with sometimes complex situations or situations that don't seem ideal, and try and think about, rather than kind of getting stuck and just, you have to try and have this clarity of how you can get around that problem. If you could just make one thing go away, I don't know. That's a tough one. I don't know if I can really answer that. This is the thing. There's so many. Sometimes there's so many things that can trip you up. It's not just all. It's not as plain sailing as you just start a business and everything works. Of course not.
In your journey, have there been any particular resources, books, tools, quotes, something that you found particularly helpful, particularly useful? Maybe a book that you find that you tend to gift, or a quote which you have stuck on your wall, or something like that?
The resource which we sort of discussed pre-show, which I'm going to mention, is called marketingexamples.com. What I really like about this, and it's something I've only really discovered recently, I think I've been subscribed to it for about 6 months, and it's just like, you get a few emails. It's not, I think it's maybe like once a month, maybe not even that frequently. And they just kind of condense concepts and principles of marketing down into really short and easy to digest chunks. I think if you're thinking about going into business, you think about leaving your job, obviously sales and marketing, even if it's not your area of speciality, they are important, right? You have to be able to go out and say, I've got this service, or I've got this solution, or I've got this product. Here's why you should buy into it. You do need to spend. I remember years ago when I was kind of starting out, I wasn't really that interested in marketing. I was much more focused on like programming and writing code and stuff. I haven't written any code now for like 8 years or so, but I was really like more interested in the technical side of things. And I used to not consider myself a marketer. Now I love marketing. But that's the thing. I think, I remember someone saying to me back in, when I was at university, like one of the mentors I had, they said, you need to spend at least one day a week on marketing and just focus like the whole day on just marketing your products, marketing your services. It's very important. So I think, check it out, marketingexamples.com. I've got no affiliation with it, but I just think it's really good. And there's some really interesting stuff on there that's kind of just condensed down that anyone can really get their head around.
Fantastic. I will link to that in the show notes. And where can people go to find you, find a bit more about you and what you do?
Yeah, if you want to check out jamesm.com/connect, there's a link there to all my social profiles. They are putting up content all the time on LinkedIn and YouTube, etc. And also, obviously, you can check out podcast.co, radio.co, and matchmaker.fm.
I will link to all of those in the show notes. James, this has been absolutely fascinating. I've loved talking to you, so thank you so much.
Cheers, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Validation. That was the key word for me that came out of this interview with James Mulvany. Validating that your idea is going to succeed. And James had some great practical tips for how to do it, using forums and discussion groups on things like Reddit, Facebook, LinkedIn. All these tools are available to us to find out what people want, what people are struggling with, what problems people have that perhaps you can find the solution to. And it's all free, so you can dive right into this without spending any money on it, just spending a little bit of time on it. I think it's great that these tools are out there to help us if we are seriously thinking about starting our own business. Links to the tools and resources that were mentioned in this interview are on the website, along with details of how you can get in touch with James, and they're all at changeworklife.com/47. And whilst you're there, there's a tab in the menu at the top of the website called Find Career Happiness. And something that might help you, including if you're thinking about starting your own business, is a couple of exercises to help you work out what sort of stuff you enjoy and also where you think your life might be going. And it's useful because particularly the second exercise can help you to make decisions. You can kind of draw this picture of what you would like your life to look like in, say, 5 years' time. And then when faced with a decision, maybe to start a new business or to start a new job, you can look at that picture and think, is this going to help me get there? Does this fit in with the picture, the future picture that I want for my life? So if you go to that tab, as I say, it's marked Find Career Happiness, then you'll find some exercises which hopefully will help you out. There's another great episode coming next week, so if you haven't, hit subscribe on whatever device you're listening to, and I can't wait to see you at next week's episode. Cheers, bye.